and today we're going to be talking about biomagnification and bioaccumulation. So first off, can someone just remind me what these terms mean? So first off, what does biomagnification mean? Anyone know from last class? No? Okay, so remember we were talking about how animals eat one another and then they accumulate different toxins in them, and it builds up as we go throughout a food chain? Ring a bell? Yeah, okay, perfect. So biomagnification basically is when toxins build up over a food chain. So there, let's start with phytoplankton, gets pollution in them, and then little fish eat the phytoplankton, and then the bigger fish will eat the small fish, and then shark will eat the big fish, and then therefore the shark will have a lot of pollutants in them because they have accumulated this toxin over the food chain. So then bioaccumulation, therefore, is toxins that accumulate within one organism. So this is tissue specific, and this is in the food chain. Does that make sense to everybody? So sometimes people don't understand the difference between them, so that's why it's really important to understand that this accumulates in the cell, and this magnifies in the food chain. So that's the way you can remember it. So therefore, we can kind of talk about the food webs and the food chain. So a food web, can someone tell me the difference between a food web and a food chain? Does anyone know?
A web would have, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, you do the web.
Okay, a web would have a lot of organisms in it, and then it shows like how species are interdependent.
Yeah, perfect. So food webs include a lot of organisms, and they have a lot of interconnections in them. So that is basically what a food chain is, but on a higher, with more organisms, and there's more interconnections with them. So a food chain is more linear. It goes in more of a linear fashion, progresses from one species to the next, where a food web includes a lot of different organisms, and there's a lot of different connections between them. So for example, the example I went over before with the fish eating the other fish and then the shark at the top. So maybe the shark eats a different type of fish which eats the bigger fish. So I guess I could draw that out. Where's my pen? So here's little phytoplankton, and then a small fish eats this, and then a bigger fish eats that, and then there's a big shark that comes over and eats them. But maybe there's another fish in this equation that also eats this fish, and that shark also eats it. So basically there's just more connections in the food web. So this is important to understand when there's toxins in a relationship with the food webs and the food chain. So some different acronyms that we went over last class is POP and PCB. And in case you didn't remember, POP stands for persistent organic pollutants, which means that they accumulate in an ecosystem and they're persistent, so they aren't able to be broken down in the digestive system of these organisms, and that's why they accumulate in organisms' tissues. The next one is PCBs, which stands for polychlorinated biphenyl, which is kind of a big word. That's just the chemicals in this acronym, and it's just another chemical that is known for bioaccumulation. So, can anyone tell me how PCBs or POPs can be released into the environment? Any ideas? So PCBs are used in agriculture. Can anyone figure out through farming how PCBs can be?
That's like over-fertilizing.
Right.
It runs off into with the rain and whatever.
Yeah. So when this chemical was created, do you think that people took into account that it would bioaccumulate into the food web? No. Unlikely, right. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that not all chemicals were created to ruin the environment. A lot of people think that PCPs and POPs are they're so bad for the environment that we shouldn't use them, but they actually serve a really good purpose for farming and different types of insects. Like you can kill a lot of insects with PCBs, which can be good for farming purposes, but it also has implications in the environment. So this is really important to know when we're looking at food chains, biomagnification, and bioaccumulation. So I have a little activity I'd like to do with you guys to demonstrate biomagnification. So if I could, I'm just going to give you guys each a styrofoam cup. Oh, there you go. Okay. So someone is just going to have to take the role of two different organisms. Just because gonna make, or maybe this will work. We'll make you guys primary producers. So just a review from our food webs. What is a primary producer? Do you guys remember?
Something that produces its own energy.
Right. And so what would be a real life example of that?
Grass.
Grass. Perfect. So you guys can be grass. Does that sound good? And what's a example of a toxic chemical that could be released into the environment?
DDT.
Sure, DDT. So this will be our DDT. You guys are going to get your pollution. It's going to be absorbed from the soil. And these are going to be represented by the marbles. Okay, and now there's going to be a primary consumer. What's an example of a primary consumer in our food chain?
A cow.
A cow, sure. So you guys are going to be cows, okay? And I'm just going to participate, and I'm going to be the secondary consumer. And what is an example of a secondary consumer?
A wolf.
A wolf, sure.
Us.
Us,
Yeah,
yes.
good
It
one.
could be humans or us. Perfect. So everyone is clear on what you guys are? Okay. So now our cows are going to go over and eat our grass. So each cow is going to eat 2 pieces of grass.
You're at 7 minutes.
Make it awkward.
Oh, I need another one.
Perfect. Okay. And now, me being a human or a wolf, I'm going to come and eat my cows. So,
Eating my cow. In the face.
all
I
right.
didn't have my food very long.
So, as a human, I have a bunch of marbles. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 marbles. So this is what is this an example of?
Bioaccumulation, because it's more.
Yes, yes. Could it also be an example of biomagnification?
That was like the process of everyone being eaten. And
Yeah,
going up.
Yeah, so it is technically an example of both biomagnification and bioaccumulation. Perfect. So now with that we understand that there can be a lot of factors in bioaccumulation and it relates to food chains. And so me being the human, I'm going to be really affected by this because I'm getting the most pollutants, right? So it really concentrates at the top of the food chain. And that's really important when it comes to population dynamics and the ecosystem and how it functions. Does that everyone understand that? Everyone's clear with that? Yeah? Cool. All right. So in my research in this lesson, I found a research study by Dr. Ross, and he was studying killer whales in BC. And so basically what he did is he looked at 2 different populations in the ocean. So there's killer whales that travel a lot down the coast of BC and into Washington and then up into Alaska. And those are called transient whales because they move a lot and they eat different things. The next type of population is residential whales that are mostly in BC waters most of the time. They eat mostly the fish off the coast of BC, and that's kind of just where they live in the ecosystem. And so what this guy did is he took blubber samples from whales of each population of both genders, and he tested to see how many pollutants and toxins were concentrated into their fat tissues. And this is a summary of his data that he found. So I'm just going to give you guys a couple minutes to look at the graph, and then I'm going to ask you some conclusions that you can make from this graph. So as you can see here, the bluish bar is the northern residence of males. So that's one right there. The second bar right here is the northern residence of female whales. And this yellow bar graph is the southern residence of a male whale. And the fourth one here is a transient mature male. So you can see that 3 of them are males and then 1 is the female. So can anyone just make some conclusions as to why he got these results? Any predictions? It could be anything. Just give a guess. So remember that the transient whales are traveling down the coast into Washington. So they have a more wide range of food. And if I scroll up here in this study, here is a picture of the food chain. So the transient whales here, they eat seals, whereas resident killer whales mostly eat salmon. So what do you think this does to the food chain? Remember we were talking how these are primary producers, these are secondary consumers, or primary consumers and then secondary consumers, and then it builds its way up, right? So do you think that these transient killer whales would accumulate more pollutants if they're higher up on the food chain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So if we go back to our graph, does that explain why this one had the most PCBs in their fat tissue?
Yeah.
Right. Awesome. So then that also explains why these males also had pollutants in it, but why was the females so small in pollutants? Does anyone have an idea?
Did it get like transferred into its like babies?
Right. Yeah, that's actually exactly right.
My other thought was maybe the males are eating more than the females.
Yeah, so those are all really good ideas, but mainly what happens in the females is when they're breastfeeding, their breast milk, they get rid of the toxins in their breast milk so that it's given to their babies, which isn't really good for the survival of their babies, but they're getting released of those toxins. Where the males don't actually have a mechanism to get rid of these pollutants.
Does that happen in humans too?
Yes, it does happen in humans. Yeah, so that's why it's really important when like females are pregnant to not eat a lot of fish because there's high mercury concentrations in
And don't
fish.
shoot drugs and don't drink.
Yes, exactly. So that's why it's super important to be aware of that when you are pregnant as a female in humans. But anyways, so back to our graph. That's kind of the results that he got. Can you guys think of ways that this whale case study can affect the populations of people in BC? So these whales are not surviving a lot. How does this affect, say, the indigenous lives of people that live off the land in BC? Or how does this affect the population or the amount of fish available for people to fish?
Well, if there's more of a top level predator, that would decrease what we can get as well, right?
So if there's a lot of whales available, then they're going to be eating more fish. But if there's not as much whales eating the fish, there's going to be a lot of fish. So that might affect the amount of phytoplankton that is available in the ocean. So that might decrease the population over time because there's not going to be as much food available for the smaller fish to eat.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. So you have to be really aware of these different pollutants in the environment because if it affects one level in the food chain or the food web, that could return to us in a way that we may not understand. So food chains are really interconnected, and it's really important to understand that.
We have 13 minutes.
Okay, so before we end off this little lesson, can we just brainstorm some ways that we could help reduce the factors of biomagnification and bioaccumulation in this food web? Just think of your daily lives. What produces PCBs and all those things?
Maybe like chemicals that you clean with, like that go down the drain or in your toilets, that could go into like fresh water systems.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, like microorganisms.
Yeah.
Especially down like city drains too, like on
Yeah.
the street, that goes straight to the river.
Yeah.
At least down your kitchen sink, it goes to a treatment plant first.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So those are really important to understand how those chemicals can affect our environment because yes, they're into our water, so then we have to spend money on treating our water, and then we also, our animals are feeding off that water, so it might negatively impact them. It's really important that as humans we understand that if we create these chemicals, we have to have proper disposal of them, right? So making sure that we take batteries or toxic cleaning chemicals to, say, the green center, or what's that?
Eco Center, yeah.
Right. So that's where you can properly dispose of that instead of just throwing it in the garbage where it goes to the landfill and then the toxins evaporate or they absorb into the soils there and then eventually they get put into our water systems, right? So that can be really toxic to the human population. Is there any other ways that we could mitigate this?
We talked about fertilizing too. Like
Yeah.
over-fertilizing.
So in agriculture, using more natural ways of fertilizing our soils, that's also a really good one. Can anyone think of any other ones just for closing? Any last thoughts? No? Okay. Well, is there any questions before I end the presentation? No? Okay. Well, next class we'll be revisiting more of this, and maybe if you guys want, you can bring your own case studies and we can look at them.